What happens when a rich man's joke turns into the most embarrassing lesson of his life? Asked the waiter who answered him in 9 languages. It started with laughter, the kind of laughter that cuts through a place meant for quiet conversation. Forks paused midair, glasses stopped halfway to lips, and eyes turned toward the corner table near the window at the Red Elm, one of the most expensive restaurants in Santa Monica, California. At that table sat Richard Langford, a tech millionaire whose voice always seemed to find the walls first. He wasn't just loud, he was the type of man who liked an audience. A gold watch glimmered on his wrist, his shirt collar open like he was allergic to humility. Around him sat 3 others, business partners, maybe friends, though the kind of friends who laughed because they had to. And standing beside them was Derek Coleman, the waiter who'd been on his feet for 7 hours straight. Derek wasn't the type to draw attention. He moved quietly, efficiently, the way someone does when they've worked hard to make peace with long days. A well-pressed black uniform, polished shoes, and a name tag that looked almost too small for someone with so much quiet dignity. He smiled faintly as he poured water into the crystal glasses, careful not to spill a drop. That's when Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "Hey man, what's your name again?" "Derek, sir," he replied, keeping his tone polite. "Derek, huh? Tell me something, Derek," Richard said, grinning. "You look like a smart guy. But let's see how smart you really are." The table laughed. Derek stayed still. He'd seen this before, men with too much money trying to find entertainment in people just trying to work. Richard continued, "I'll make you a deal. You serve me in Chinese, the whole thing, every word you say, and I'll give you $100,000, right here, tonight." The laughter that followed was louder this time, echoing through the restaurant. A woman at the next table glanced over. A couple at the bar stopped talking. Derek's hand froze midair, holding the pitcher. He blinked once, then set it down gently. "Sir," he said slowly, "you're serious about that?" "Dead serious," Richard said, grinning wide, his friends chuckling beside him. "I've been to Beijing 3 times. I know when someone's faking it, so let's see what you got." Derek's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite defiance, just calm. "All right then," he said quietly. The air shifted. Something about his tone made people turn their heads. The music from the restaurant's speakers faded into the background. Derek looked Richard in the eye and began to speak, his voice steady, fluid. The words rolled off his tongue like water over glass. Perfect Mandarin, smooth and effortless. He greeted him formally, asked how his evening was, then described the day's special in tones so precise that even a native speaker would have nodded in respect. At first, Richard laughed again, as if waiting for a mistake, but none came. Derek spoke confidently, the rhythm of his words natural, his pronunciation flawless. He didn't stutter, he didn't pause. When he finished, he gave a short bow and said, "Would you like me to continue in another language?" The laughter died instantly. For a moment, nobody said a word. Even the clink of dishes from the kitchen seemed to stop. One of Richard's guests looked at him, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. Derek simply stood there, hands behind his back, waiting for an answer, but Richard didn't speak. He just stared, the smirk fading, the arrogance thinning into disbelief. But this wasn't where Derek's story began, because what happened that night wasn't luck. It was the result of years of struggle, sacrifice, and dreams buried under bills and long shifts. Before that night at the Red Elm, before the laughter and the challenge that would change everything, Derek Coleman was just another face lost in the rhythm of survival. He lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Pasadena, with thin walls that let in every sound from the street below. Sirens, traffic, and sometimes the laughter of neighbors who seemed to have life figured out. Most mornings started before sunrise. Derek would brew coffee in a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Brother," a gift from his sister before she moved to Dallas years ago. He'd sit at the small kitchen table with a notepad, scribbling words in different languages. That was his ritual. 30 minutes every morning, before the noise of the world crept in, just him, a pen, and his dream. He'd taught himself languages the way some people teach themselves to breathe, naturally, almost desperately. At first it was French, then Spanish, then Swahili. Mandarin came later, mostly from old textbooks and hours spent listening to online lectures after his shifts. He didn't have a college degree, not anymore. He'd dropped out of the University of Oregon during his junior year when his mother got sick. Bills piled up fast, and soon, studying phonetics and syntax gave way to studying restaurant menus and tip percentages. But Derek never complained. He had that quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Every word he learned, every phrase he mastered, felt like a small rebellion against the life he was living. One of his co-workers, Lena Morales, a waitress who'd worked at the Red Elm for almost a decade, used to tease him. "Derek, what's the point of knowing all those languages? You planning to run the UN from table 5? She'd joke, sliding past him with a tray of drinks. He'd chuckle softly. "Nah, just keeping my brain from falling asleep." "You're weird," she'd laugh. "Yeah," he'd say with a shrug. "But at least I'm weird in 9 different languages." It was that kind of quiet humor that kept him going. Still, deep down, there was something heavier, a weight that came from knowing how close he'd been to a different life. A career, maybe teaching, maybe interpreting, maybe traveling, but that version of his life had been paused indefinitely. After his mother passed, Derek's world got smaller. The university called about unfinished credits. Debt collectors called about unpaid loans. Opportunity stopped calling altogether. The Red Elm became his world. Polished tables, foreign wine lists, and faces that rarely looked him in the eye. Yet, Derek carried his dreams like hidden treasure. When customers from abroad came in, he'd quietly surprise them by greeting them in their native language. A few would smile in disbelief, asking how he learned. Others just nodded, too surprised to respond. But no one ever looked at him the way Richard Langford did that night, with mockery. There was one night that stood out before everything changed. A family from Morocco had come in, parents and their teenage daughter visiting California for the first time. Derek overheard the father struggling to order, so he gently stepped in, speaking to them in Arabic. The family's faces lit up. The father placed a hand over his heart and said, "Thank you. You make us feel welcome." That moment stayed with him, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it reminded him that his knowledge still mattered, even in small corners of the world. But no good deed could change the fact that Derek lived paycheck to paycheck. Some weeks he'd choose between groceries and the electricity bill. Some nights he'd eat ramen and read old notes about Latin grammar, as if holding on to the hope that one day life might look different. But life has a strange way of testing you when you least expect it. And Derek's test came that Friday night, the one that would make strangers whisper his name for weeks afterward. Friday nights at the Red Elm were always a storm. Polished shoes moving fast, orders flying between tables, and the faint smell of seared steak and white truffle drifting through the air. It wasn't just another night for Derek Coleman. It was payday. Rent was due on Monday, and he'd been counting his tips in his head since noon. The restaurant was already full when the reservation came in. Table 9, window seat. A party of 4 under the name Richard Langford. The staff knew the name. Rich tech entrepreneur. Loud. Big tips if you smiled enough, or nothing at all if you didn't laugh at his jokes. When the hostess told Derek he'd been assigned to that table, he sighed quietly, but nodded. "Got it," he said, tucking his notepad into his apron. Richard arrived late, the kind of late that said, "You'll wait for me." He walked in wearing a deep blue blazer over a t-shirt that probably cost more than Derek's rent. His friends trailed behind him, 2 men in business casual and a woman with diamond earrings that caught every bit of light. "Table 9, the hostess said, smiling as if she were introducing royalty. Richard didn't thank her. He just smirked and said, "Hope you got the good waiter tonight." Derek greeted them at the table. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Red Elm. My name is Derek, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Richard leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Derek, cool name," he said. "You sound like you take this job seriously." "I try to do my best," Derek replied calmly, handing out menus. Richard grinned. "That's all we can do in life, right?" "Try our best." He turned to his friends. "Except some people's best just looks different than others." They laughed. Derek smiled politely and waited. He'd heard worse. "What's the special?" one of the men asked. Derek began listing it, describing the pan-seared halibut with saffron risotto and roasted fennel, his voice measured and professional. But before he could finish, Richard interrupted. "Hold up," he said, raising a hand. "Say that again, but make it sound international. You know, fancy. You ever been overseas?" "No, sir," Derek said. That's too bad." "Maybe one day," Richard replied, leaning forward. "You seem like you'd appreciate culture. You know, accents, food, language, that kind of stuff." Derek kept his tone even. I try to learn something new every day. Oh yeah? Like what? Richard asked, clearly entertained. Derek shrugged slightly. Languages, mostly. That made Richard laugh out loud. Languages? Come on, man, you work in a restaurant. You don't have time for that. The others chuckled with him. One of the men said, maybe he's got one of those translation apps? Derek just smiled again and said softly, no app. Just practice. Richard tilted his head, watching him. He wasn't used to people staying composed under his teasing. He wanted a reaction, something to show he still had control. So you think you're a smart guy, huh? Richard asked, smirking. Derek shook his head. No, sir. I just like learning. The woman beside Richard whispered something, but he waved her off. Nah, this is interesting. Let's have some fun. He picked up his glass, took a sip of wine, and grinned wider. All right, Derek. How about this? I'll give you $100,000 if you can serve me in Chinese. The laughter that followed was sharp. A couple nearby turned their heads. One of the bartenders looked up from polishing glasses. Derek stood still. No blink, no smile, just a small breath through his nose. Richard raised an eyebrow. What's the matter? Don't tell me you only pretend to know languages. Derek set his notepad on the table. Are you serious about that offer? Dead serious, Richard said. Prove me wrong. The restaurant quieted. Even the background chatter softened into whispers. Derek looked around for a moment, then met Richard's eyes again. All right, he said, voice calm as ever. But what happened next wasn't just a response. It was a lifetime of discipline, pain, and hidden brilliance ready to break through the walls of that dining room. For a few seconds, the air in the Red Elm didn't move. Forks hovered mid-air, laughter hung unfinished, and all eyes settled on Derek Coleman, the quiet waiter, now standing across from a man who thought money could buy humility. Derek's mind wasn't racing. It was still. Years of late nights, dictionaries, and notebooks flooded him, but not as noise, as calm. He knew exactly what he was about to do. He adjusted his tie slightly and gave a slow nod. Okay, he said softly. Let's begin. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking, clearly expecting a joke. Go ahead, Professor, he said. But Derek didn't smile. He stepped closer to the table, straightened his posture, and began speaking. Not in English, but in Mandarin Chinese. His voice flowed with precision, every tone landing where it should. He greeted the group formally, welcomed them to the Red Elm, and introduced the menu with the ease of someone who'd spoken the language for years. His pronunciation was clean, his rhythm natural. At first, Richard laughed, a nervous, mocking kind of laugh, but it faded fast. Derek wasn't fumbling. He wasn't pretending. He was fluent. The woman beside Richard blinked and whispered, "Wait, he's actually speaking it." Derek continued, describing the halibut, the steak, and the house red wines, all in Mandarin. He even switched to the proper dialectal phrasing for medium rare and chef's recommendation. The room stayed silent, except for the occasional gasp from nearby tables. When he finished the full explanation, he gave a small bow and added in Mandarin, "Would you like me to repeat it in another language?" Richard blinked. "What did you just say?" Derek smiled faintly. "I asked if you'd like me to continue in another language, sir." "You're joking." "No, sir." "I can serve you in 9." Laughter rippled again. But this time, it wasn't cruel. It was disbelief. Derek turned slightly and without hesitation switched to French, then Italian, his accent shifting effortlessly. His tone matched the rhythm of each language perfectly, softening in French, lilting in Italian. Then he turned toward one of the business partners who looked Middle Eastern and spoke in Arabic, wishing him peace and thanking him for dining there. The man's eyes widened. It was perfect. He switched again, this time to Swahili, then Japanese, then German. The transitions were seamless, like a conductor changing instruments mid-performance. The entire restaurant had gone still. Even the manager stood frozen near the bar, unsure whether to interrupt or applaud. Derek finished by speaking in English, his voice steady and low. "Language," he said, "isn't a trick. It's respect. It's how you say, 'I see you. I value your presence.' You asked me to serve you in Chinese, sir. But what you really asked was whether I was worth your respect." Richard didn't move. His smirk was gone. His friends looked anywhere but at him. Derek waited. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then a man from another table clapped. Just once. It echoed through the quiet room. Another clap followed. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant joined in. Quiet, genuine applause that filled the air with something heavy and pure. Derek didn't bow. He didn't need to. He just smiled politely, collected the menus, and said, "I'll give you a moment to decide, sir." Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped. For the first time all evening, he looked small. Like the room had somehow grown around him. Derek turned to leave, his steps measured, his back straight. As he walked away, Richard whispered, almost to himself, 9 languages. The woman beside him leaned forward. "You really should apologize," she murmured. But the apology didn't come. Not yet. Because before pride gives way to humility, there's always that moment of silence where a man has to face himself first. For a full minute, the restaurant stayed in that strange, heavy silence. The kind that presses on your chest. The kind that makes everyone aware of their own heartbeat. Derek had walked away from table 9, leaving the millionaire and his friends sitting among their untouched wine glasses and their fading laughter. At the bar, Lena Morales whispered to another server, "Did you just hear that?" He actually spoke all those languages? Her coworker shook his head. "Man, Derek's been here 2 years, and I never even heard him raise his voice. I didn't know he could do that." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the chef peeked out through the door's porthole, wiping his hands on a towel. The sound of clapping had reached him too. "What's going on out there?" he asked, and one of the dishwashers said quietly, "You might want to see this one yourself." Back at the table, Richard Langford's arrogance had started to evaporate, replaced by something unfamiliar. Discomfort. He shifted in his chair, pretending to laugh again, but it came out hollow. His friends weren't laughing anymore. The woman with the diamond earrings cleared her throat. "That was actually incredible," she said softly. "You shouldn't have said that to him, Richard." He waved her off, forcing a chuckle. "Relax, it was just a joke." "Didn't sound like a joke," one of the men muttered. Richard shot him a look but didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his glass again, stared at the wine, and then set it down untouched. His reflection looked back at him, and for the first time, he didn't look amused by it. A few tables away, Derek was taking another order as if nothing had happened. His hands didn't shake. His voice was even. He'd learned a long time ago that dignity doesn't require an audience. But the room was still buzzing with what they'd seen. A man who had been mocked had stood his ground without anger, without shouting, without needing to prove anything through aggression. Just intelligence, composure, and grace. The restaurant manager, Mr. Hines, approached Derek quietly near the back counter. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice. "That was something else back there." Derek turned, a bit cautious. "Am I in trouble?" Hines laughed. "Trouble? You just made half the restaurant rethink their life choices. No, you're fine. You handled it perfectly." "Just doing my job," Derek said quietly. "Yeah, well," Hines added, "most people would have walked out or thrown the tray at the guy. You didn't. That's something." A few minutes later, Richard stood up. The movement caught everyone's attention again. He buttoned his blazer, cleared his throat, and looked around as if trying to find words. Then he started walking, not toward the exit, but toward Derek. The staff froze. Even the host paused mid-conversation. Richard stopped beside Derek at the service station, where Derek was carefully aligning glasses on a tray. He looked up, surprised but calm. "Derek," Richard began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier bravado. "Listen, about earlier. That was—" Derek interrupted gently. "You don't have to apologize, sir." "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "I do. That was arrogant. I thought I was being funny, but I wasn't. You proved something tonight. To me. To everyone." Derek gave a small nod. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. Just doing my work." Richard looked down, embarrassed. 9 languages? Where'd you learn all that?" Derek smiled faintly. "Here and there. Books. Online. A few good people along the way. You ever think about doing something else?" Derek shrugged. "Every day." For a moment, the two men stood there. One used to being seen, the other used to being overlooked, and somehow, both were learning something about themselves. Then, Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and started writing. Derek stepped back, confused. Sir, that's not necessary. Richard didn't look up. No, it is. He tore out the check and held it out. I said 100,000 if you could serve me in Chinese. You did more than that. Derek didn't take it. He just looked at the paper, then back at Richard. I don't want your money. Richard blinked. You're turning it down? Derek nodded. Respect means more than a check. Besides, if I took it, people would think I did it for this. I didn't. Richard stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly, he folded the check and slipped it into Derek's apron pocket anyway. Then don't take it as a reward, he said quietly. Take it as an apology. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but Richard had already turned and walked away. But that wasn't the end of it, because what happened after that night reached far beyond the walls of the Red Elm. The story of that night didn't stay within the walls of the Red Elm for long. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Someone had filmed part of the exchange, the moment Derek switched from Mandarin to French to Arabic, and posted it online. The clip had over 1 million views before Derek even woke up. When he walked into work that afternoon, phones were already ringing off the hook. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Hines, looked both amused and overwhelmed. Congratulations, kid, he said, handing Derek a cup of coffee. You've gone viral. Derek blinked. Viral? Yeah, Hines said, grinning. You're all over the internet. People are calling you the polyglot waiter. You've got reporters trying to reach you, college professors tweeting about you, even someone from a language foundation asking for an interview. Derek rubbed the back of his neck, unsure whether to smile or panic. I didn't do anything special, he said. Lena walked by, laughing. Didn't do anything special? You embarrassed a millionaire in front of half of Santa Monica. That's not special. That's legendary. Derek smiled weakly. He didn't feel like a legend. He just felt seen for once. Later that evening, when things had calmed down, Mr. Hines approached him again. You might want to check your messages, he said. Someone left an envelope for you this morning. Derek frowned. From who? Didn't say. Just your name on it. The envelope was plain white, sealed neatly, his name written in clean handwriting. Inside was a short note. Derek, thank you for teaching me something money can't buy. I kept the check where it belongs, in your pocket. But if you ever need help getting where you're meant to be, call me. R.L. Below the initials was a business card. Richard Langford, Langford Innovations. Derek folded the note and tucked it back into the envelope. He didn't call, not yet. Something in him wanted to prove he could stand on his own before reaching out. But Richard wasn't done trying to make things right. A week later, he returned to the Red Elm. This time without the entourage, without the noise. He waited quietly at the bar until Derek finished with another table. When Derek saw him, he hesitated, unsure if this was another test. Richard stood and extended his hand. You remember me? Derek shook it. Hard to forget. I meant what I wrote, Richard said. I've been thinking a lot about that night. You didn't just embarrass me. You reminded me how small I can act when I forget what real intelligence looks like. Derek nodded slowly. We all forget sometimes. I want to help, Richard said. No cameras, no headlines, just help. You said you studied linguistics before? Let me get you back there. I can cover the tuition. Consider it restitution. Derek hesitated. The offer was real, but so was his pride. I appreciate it, he said, but I'm not sure I'm ready to go back. Richard smiled faintly. Then I'll keep the offer open. Just don't waste what you've got. The world needs people who speak more than words, people who understand meaning. When Richard left, Derek sat at the counter for a long time, turning the business card between his fingers. Maybe it wasn't about taking the money. Maybe it was about letting go of the part of him that stopped believing he still had a future. That night, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Derek lingered in the dining room. The chairs were stacked, the floor polished, the silence heavy. He looked out the window where the city lights reflected on the glass and whispered something to himself in Mandarin. Respect can't be bought. It's earned, and sometimes it's taught. But the story didn't end there, because what came next would show just how far an act of humility could reach. 2 months later, Derek Coleman's life looked nothing like it did before that night at the Red Elm. The video had turned him into something of an online symbol, a reminder that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit. Reporters called, podcasts wanted interviews, universities sent invitations, but Derek turned most of them down. He wasn't chasing fame, he just wanted peace, and maybe a chance to rebuild his dream. One morning, as the California sun poured through his apartment window, he opened his laptop and found an email from the University of Oregon, his old school. The subject line read, "Scholarship Reinstatement Proposal." Inside, a professor he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade had written, "We saw the story about you. The department would like to invite you back to complete your degree. Full coverage, no conditions. The world needs people like you representing what language can mean." Derek sat there for a while, reading it over and over. He smiled, then laughed quietly to himself. For years, he'd buried that part of his life under double shifts and bills. Now, it was knocking again. He quit the restaurant a month later. His last shift was bittersweet. Hugs from coworkers, applause from customers who recognized him, and a final handshake from Mr. Hines, who said, "Don't come back unless it's as a guest." And that's exactly what Derek did. A year later, he returned to the Red Elm, this time wearing a suit, not a uniform. The restaurant was quieter that night, and when he walked in, the hostess recognized him instantly. "Table for one?" she asked, smiling. Derek nodded. Yeah, just one halfway through his meal, a familiar face appeared at his table, Richard Langford. He looked different now, no entourage, no smug grin, just a man carrying humility. "Mind if I join you?" Richard asked. Derek gestured toward the empty chair. "Please." They sat in silence for a moment, both aware of the irony. The same restaurant, the same man, but everything had changed. "I heard you went back to school," Richard said finally. "Yeah," Derek replied, "graduating next semester." "That's incredible," Richard said. "You know, that night still plays in my head. You didn't just embarrass me. You taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn." Derek smiled faintly. People teach us things in strange ways. Sometimes the lesson just comes wrapped in pride. Richard nodded. "I deserve that." "Maybe," Derek said, "but you also grew from it. That's what matters." The two men sat for another hour, not as millionaire and waiter, but as equals. When they stood to leave, Richard extended his hand. "Thank you, Derek." For everything, Derek shook it. "No need to thank me, Richard. Just keep talking to people. Really talking. You'd be surprised what you learn when you stop testing and start listening." Outside, the night air was warm and calm. Derek walked home slowly, taking the long way. He passed a group of young people laughing outside a cafe. One of them asked him for directions. In Spanish. Without hesitation, Derek smiled and replied fluently, pointing them the right way. As they thanked him, he switched to French, then back to English, leaving them amazed. He laughed softly to himself as he continued down the sidewalk. He didn't need applause. He didn't need money. He had something far better. Peace, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that words could build bridges where pride once built walls. That night, before bed, Derek opened a new notebook and wrote one simple line across the first page. "Respect is the only language everyone understands." Then he underlined it twice, closed the book, and turned off the light. And that's the lesson, isn't it? You never really know who you're talking to, or what they've been through. The person you underestimate today might be the one who teaches you tomorrow. So before you judge, before you mock, before you test someone's worth, remember, kindness costs nothing, and respect speaks louder than any language. If this story moved you, share it, not for views, but for someone who might need to hear that their talent still matters, even when the world forgets to look.